The basement archives of Fort Meade smelled of dust and stale air. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, unwelcoming glow. Rows of cardboard boxes stretched into the shadows, each one stamped with codes and dates no one outside the intelligence world would ever understand. It was 1995, just months after the CIA had admitted, reluctantly, that a program called Stargate had existed. To the public, the admission was almost laughable. The US government had funded psychic spies. The official line was that it had been a waste of time and money. But the box marked Stargate/1978 suggested otherwise. Inside were manila folders filled with hand-drawn sketches. Strange, almost childlike outlines of domes, rivers, and cranes. At first glance, they looked meaningless. But then came the attachments, satellite photos of Soviet military facilities. The resemblance was unmistakable. The sketches had come before the photos. At the top of the pages, one cryptic note, "Remote viewer number 14." There was more. Memos stamped confidential, praising the accuracy of certain sessions. Transcripts where viewers described echoing metallic sounds, large gantry cranes, cold underground chambers. Again and again, the details matched facilities thousands of miles away. And at the bottom of one folder, a chilling phrase. Viewer number 14 terminated under unusual circumstances. No explanation. No closure. Just silence. The government had told the public Stargate was useless. But the box whispered another truth. Sometimes, impossibly, it had worked. The roots of Stargate began not in America, but in Moscow. In the early 1970s, U.S. intelligence intercepted reports that the Soviets were pouring money into parapsychology, telepathy, telekinesis, and extrasensory perception. Most scientists scoffed. But inside the CIA, memories of being blindsided by Sputnik still lingered. The question was simple: what if the Soviets were ahead? The CIA's answer was to launch its own program. At Stanford Research Institute in California, physicists Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff began the first American experiments under the code name Scanate. Volunteers, some scientists, some self-proclaimed psychics, were placed in small, bare rooms. They were given only latitude and longitude coordinates. No photos, no maps. Their job: describe what they saw. At first, the results seemed random. Scribbles that looked like clouds, fragments of color, vague shapes. But then came the hits. One viewer drew a massive crane at a Soviet naval yard, weeks before satellite photos confirmed its existence. Another described an underground missile storage facility, complete with cylindrical shapes that matched later intelligence reports. The results were inconsistent, but they were enough to keep the funding alive. Over the years, the project changed names: Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sun Streak, until finally, in the early 1980s, it became known simply as Stargate. By then, the program had an office at Fort Meade. Remote viewers, many of them military personnel, were being asked not just to experiment, but to operate. Their visions were no longer just curiosities. They were reports, intelligence to be filed alongside satellite images and intercepted communications. The Cold War had opened a new battlefield: the human mind. In 1973, a man named Pat Price sat in a silent room at Stanford Research Institute. Price was no soldier. He was a former police commissioner from California, soft-spoken, balding, with thick glasses. Hardly the image of a spy. In front of him lay a piece of paper with nothing but numbers, geographic coordinates. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and began to speak. "I see large metallic structures. A crane, massive. Water nearby. Machinery clanging." He picked up a pencil and sketched. Rectangles became warehouses. Tall frames became cranes. Curved lines became water. Weeks later, when the sealed envelope containing the target location was opened, the result stunned the observers. The coordinates pointed to a Soviet naval yard in Leningrad. Satellite images taken days after Price's session showed the same cranes, the same waterfront. It was uncanny. Too uncanny to dismiss. Price repeated the feat multiple times. Once, he described an American military base so accurately that his CIA handlers grew nervous. If he could spy on them, what stopped the Soviets from doing the same? Price's death in 1975 cut his career short. Officially, it was a heart attack. Unofficially, some whispered it was something darker. But by then, the program had its proof. Remote viewing wasn't consistent. But sometimes, when it worked, it was terrifyingly precise. By the early 1980s, the experiments had become operations. Remote viewers were no longer asked to simply prove their abilities. They were given missions. In 1979, when American hostages were taken in Tehran, the CIA turned to Fort Meade. Viewers described rooms with barred windows, a courtyard, and frightened men inside. Their sketches matched the embassy compound. It wasn't enough to rescue the hostages, but it provided intelligence no satellite could. Other missions followed. One viewer sketched the design of a massive, bulbous Soviet submarine. Analysts laughed, until years later, when the Typhoon-class submarine was revealed to the world. Another described a secret Soviet research facility with underground chambers and cylindrical objects. Months later, intelligence confirmed it was a missile storage site. The successes were real, but so were the failures. Sometimes the sketches were nonsense. Sometimes they led analysts down dead ends. The program became a lightning rod, defended by some generals, mocked by others. But in the paranoid world of the Cold War, even a chance of success was worth the gamble. Stargate had proven it could deliver intelligence no other method could. And so, the missions kept coming. Not everyone believed. In 1988, the National Research Council was asked to evaluate Stargate. Their report was damning: no useful intelligence. Statistically insignificant. Poor methodology. For the viewers, it was a blow. They knew their visions weren't perfect. But they also knew they had produced sketches and descriptions that defied explanation. The Pentagon was divided. Some saw Stargate as a cheap experiment with potential. Others saw it as a circus act. Even the viewers themselves struggled. Were they seeing real things, or just fragments of imagination? Some confessed to migraines, sleepless nights, blurred lines between memory and vision. A few wondered if they were losing their grip on reality. And yet, the program survived. Because nobody wanted to be the one who killed it, only to learn the Soviets had perfected it. Doubt was its curse, but also its lifeline. With the Cold War over, Stargate's days were numbered. In 1995, an independent review declared remote viewing useless. The CIA seized the opportunity. At a press conference, they admitted the program's existence, then dismissed it as a failure. Reporters laughed. Headlines mocked the psychic spies. For the viewers, it was devastating. 20 years of work, erased with a single press release. But the documents told a murkier story. Among the declassified files were transcripts that matched targets with eerie accuracy. Not enough to prove psychic spying beyond doubt, but enough to raise questions. If Stargate had been truly worthless, why had it lasted so long? Why had it been funded across 5 presidencies? The official line was clear. The truth remained buried. For the intelligence world, Stargate was just another failed project. But for the viewers, it had left scars. Sessions blurred into dreams. Dreams bled into daily life. Some saw visions when they didn't want to. Others lost track of what was memory and what was imagination. Families struggled. Secrets weighed heavily. Children grew up with parents who seemed distant, half-present. Some viewers coped with humor, calling themselves Jedi. Others turned to alcohol. A few slipped into paranoia. When the program ended, they were left with nothing. No recognition. No medals. Just the memory of sitting in silent rooms, sketching things no one believed. For them, Stargate was not an experiment. It was a spiral, and many never found their way out. One mission stood out above all others, not because it targeted the Soviets, but because it targeted someone closer to home. The viewers were given a name, Robert Calder. No coordinates, no photo. Just a name. One viewer described water, wooden docks, men in suits. Panic. Silence. The sketches showed warehouses and a pier. Next to them, the words, "He won't leave here." Months later, Calder disappeared from Oakland's waterfront. His body was never found. His file was never acknowledged. Inside Fort Meade, the case became a ghost story. Proof, some said, that the program had been twisted for darker purposes. Not just spying on enemies, but on Americans. The file was buried. The questions never were. In 1998, a retired case officer broke his silence. Over coffee in his living room, he handed a researcher a photocopied memo from 1984. The words were chilling. Affirm continued funding under contingency operations, with emphasis on sensitive domestic applications. Domestic. The officer explained that not all targets were foreign. Sometimes they looked inward, union leaders, political radicals, even dissident groups. It wasn't every day, he said. But it happened. And nobody said no. The memo was never found in archives. The officer died a few years later. His obituary said nothing of Stargate. But his statement lived on, a reminder that the truth about Stargate was far stranger, and far closer, than anyone wanted to admit. Stargate ended in 1995, but its shadow lingers. Thousands of declassified pages now sit in the CIA's digital reading room. Some are laughably vague. Others are hauntingly accurate. A few defy explanation entirely. For skeptics, the program proves nothing but Cold War paranoia. For believers, it proves the government glimpsed something real, then buried it. The truth lies somewhere in between. What is undeniable is that for more than 2 decades, the United States funded psychic spying. Real missions. Real budgets. Real reports. A project so bizarre it sounds fictional, except it wasn't. The legacy of Stargate is not just about psychics. It is about fear, secrecy, and the lengths governments will go to when they think their enemies might be one step ahead. And perhaps the most haunting part, if they believed it once, who's to say they don't still?